Hello everyone, and welcome to Rome Retold. I am your host Tim, and together we'll be venturing on a journey to explore the history of ancient Rome. Today, on episode 2, we'll be exploring the very beginning of Rome's origins, back before the city of Rome itself even existed. And we'll explore how the Romans created a legend that intertwined with Greek mythology to explain their own origins. Although we'll go through a lot of names and places in this episode, don't stress yourself out too much if you find yourself struggling to keep everything straight. Not every single name is important, and not every place is necessary to remember. Instead, try and focus on the overarching picture of what the Romans were trying to illustrate, and how their origin myth might have influenced the way they thought about themselves. Now, our tale begins in a place where almost all Greek and Roman myths visit in some form or another, and it's a place that's probably familiar to most of you as well, the ancient city of Troy. Now, the legend of Troy has been passed on for thousands of years now, and the names and accomplishments of those involved in this epic conflict have truly been immortalized. These legends were passed on orally for centuries, until a Greek writer by the name of Homer wrote the collection of stories down into two major works, titled the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, there were other authors who wrote various stories about the legendary siege of Troy as well, and these stories are part of what is now known as the epic cycle, but Homer is undoubtedly the most famous contributor. Now, I'm not going to enter into any great detail on the legend of Troy itself, although they are fascinating in their own right, and personally, I think it's amazing to see how such an old story has held our attention for so many thousands of years. What I am going to focus on, and where Rome's story begins, is a distant member of Troy's royal family that managed to escape the final destruction of the city and land himself on a distant shore in a place that would one day be called Italy. Now, this person is none other than Aeneas, who was a hero who's been immortalized by Virgil's book, the Aeneid. Now, to start off with a bit of a background, Aeneas' father was a man by the name of Anchises, and he was a first cousin of King Priam, the ruler of Troy. This meant that Aeneas was a second cousin to the princes of Troy, Hector and Paris, and although this places him as a somewhat minor character, he was nonetheless of royal and noble blood. Now, the Romans maintained that Aeneas had managed to escape Troy with a small band of followers, and after going on an odyssey of his own, he eventually settled in what is today central Italy. Now, from there, the Romans maintained that Aeneas went on to father a long dynasty, one that would eventually see the birth of Romulus and Remus and the birth of Rome itself. So how did Aeneas manage to escape the city alive, and what was his journey? In Homer's Iliad, Aeneas was only a minor character, but he was spared by the gods several times during combat. Now, although Aeneas was a brave and capable fighter in his own right, he repeatedly found himself in over his head, and the gods found it necessary to intervene and save his life, as they prophesied that he had been marked for future greatness. Now, this theme was not really expanded upon by Homer, but it wasn't lost on the later Romans, and they were therefore quick to pick it up and place Aeneas at the center of their own origin story. So Virgil, the Roman author of the Aeneid, detailed how Aeneas had managed to flee Troy in the final hours with a small group of followers, including his son Ascanius and his father Anchises. Anchises, who was an old man, was supposedly carried on Aeneas' back as they fled to safety. Along with them, they took several statues of the gods to save these holy relics from destruction by the Greeks, but also they were meant to keep themselves safe on their own journey, as they believed that by protecting these sacred relics of the gods that they would win the gods' favor. Now, one of these statues was a sacred palladium, or the statue of Pallas Athena. Now, Pallas was a common epithet given to Athena by the Greeks, and it meant something along the lines of most renowned one. Now, the palladium was particularly significant because the Trojans believed that it had fallen straight from heaven, sent from Athena herself, in answer to the prayer of Ilus, who was the founder of Troy. Now, this is why Troy is most often referred to as Ilium by the Greeks, and is why it was called the Iliad by Homer. Now, it was believed that as long as the Palladium remained within the walls of the city, no harm could ever come to Troy. Now, in the Iliad, Odysseus and Diomedes sneak into Troy one night and steal the Palladium, and this is what Homer said allowed the Trojans to eventually succumb to the Greeks in the end. The Trojans fell victim to the Trojan horse because the sacred statue of Athena was not there to protect them. In the Aeneid, however, Virgil states that Odysseus had actually only escaped with a fake copy of the Palladium, and that in truth Aeneas had managed to escape with the true statue. In another version of the story, Odysseus had actually placed the Palladium in a shrine located outside the city of Troy, and Aeneas had managed to go to that shrine and take the true Palladium with him when they left. Either way, there's a bit of some conflicting information there, but what's really important and what the Romans found important was that they believed that either way, Aeneas had the real Palladium and he had escaped the shores of Troy with it in his possession. So, managing to secure themselves a boat, Aeneas and his followers sailed around the Mediterranean for several years, and they had several dangerous scrapes with death. Now, they first stopped at the island of Delos, and they were told a prophecy by Apollo regarding their fate. Now, although they were war-torn refugees with little hope for survival, Apollo told Aeneas that he was destined to found a new city in the land of his forefathers, and that they would spawn a new civilization for the ages. However, they misinterpret this prophecy, and they think Apollo was speaking of the island of Crete. Aeneas and his father Anchises believed that it referred to their ancestors that had once lived at Knossos in Crete, and therefore they set sail for that island. But once they landed on the shores of Crete, they ended up enduring a plague for 1 year, before the religious statues that they had brought with them from Troy spoke to Aeneas in a dream one night, and they cleared everything up for him and told him that he was really, truly meant to go to Italy, where his ancestor Dardanus, who was a son of Zeus, was from. So, with that information in hand, Aeneas and his band departed Crete and sailed westward, avoiding some dangerous monsters along the way, like harpies, a cyclops, and even the monster Scylla. During a stop on the western coast of Sicily, Aeneas' father Anchises finally died peacefully of old age. They laid him to rest on a funeral pyre, and from there they continued on with their journey. Their next stop was the city of Carthage, after nearly 6 years of wandering so far. And Aeneas began a love affair with the queen of Carthage, Queen Dido. Now they planned to marry and settle the Trojans in Carthage permanently, but the messenger god Mercury eventually visited Aeneas and warned him that he had to continue on with his true purpose and to fulfill his destiny, which was again to found a new city for the descendants of Troy in Italy. Now, realizing that Mercury was right and that he had to continue on with his destiny, Aeneas therefore made preparations to leave. Now, given that Aeneas and Queen Dido were betrothed to one another, Aeneas was worried that she might try and prevent his departure. So to avoid this, he gathered his remaining band of refugees, and they all stole away in the night, back on their boat, and began sailing back to Italy. Now Queen Dido, enraged at having been abandoned, curses Aeneas and all of his descendants to forever be at war with Carthage. Now this is, of course, meant to foreshadow the later Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage. After that, Queen Dido committed suicide by stabbing herself in the heart. After leaving Carthage, the Trojans revisited Sicily one more time on their way to Italy, and they hosted a series of funeral games to honor Anchises, who had now died the year before. Now, Aeneas was worried that they hadn't done enough to honor his father, and Virgil dedicates quite a few pages for detailing the games and competitions that were held. Now, this section is most likely meant to mirror Homer's description in the Iliad of the funeral games celebrated for Patroclus after his death during the Trojan War. Next, they travel to the underworld, similar to Odysseus in the Odyssey, where they meet Cerberus, pass by the Tartarus, the dungeon where all of the wicked dead are kept, and they even saw Queen Dido again, who Aeneas had most likely hoped to avoid, and she remained extremely mad about having been abandoned. Finally, after this, they went to Elysium, the place of heroes who lived a happy afterlife, and Aeneas met his father again, who tells him of his great destiny still to come. From there, the Trojans made their way to the western shores of Italy, where they were greeted by Latinus, who was the king of the Latin tribe. Latinus welcomed the Trojan refugees into his land, and he allowed them to settle and begin anew. Latinus had been told a prophecy himself that he should wed his daughter to a prominent man from a foreign land. And so, after Aeneas' arrival, he became convinced that Aeneas must be the one that his prophecy had told him about. Unfortunately, however, he had already betrothed his daughter Lavinia to a foreign king. But to rectify this, Latinus simply canceled the marriage and married her off to Aeneas instead. The foreign king, who had his wedding canceled, did the only reasonable thing he could in this situation, and that was he declared war on everyone. Aeneas therefore went to get further help for the upcoming war, and he visited the nearby Tuscans, who had settled on the site of the Palatine Hill. Their leader was Evander, a Greek from Arcadia, which is in central Greece, and he had settled to Italy before the Trojan War had even happened. Now, Evander was an aristocrat himself, and he had met Aeneas' father Anchises before the Trojan War, and he remembered their family and knew that they were honorable and probably deserved some help. So Evander and Aeneas promptly joined forces, and they fought the war, and after several intense battles, the Latins and Trojans ended up prevailing. Now, during one of these battles, unfortunately, Latinus had died, and so Aeneas, therefore, being married to his daughter, became the king of the Latins, and his son Ascanius would go on to succeed him. Aeneas founded a new city called Lavinium after his wife Lavinia. That brings us to the end of the legend of Aeneas and how the Trojans came to be settled in Italy. We'll pick the story up from there in our next episode, but I have a few more comments regarding the importance of this myth and why it's worth remembering, despite the fact that it is no doubt a myth. Now, I'd like to start by pointing out that Greek literature very often involved tragedy, meaning it contained many elements of deadly conflict, irony, and things just simply not going well. A lot of this was a result of the Greek outlook on life in ancient times. They realized that life was often difficult, brutal, and unfair, and that all you could do was simply suffer your fate with your head held high, as they believed one's fate was ultimately inescapable. Now, the Greeks believed that humans were only the playthings of the gods, and that any attempts to avoid your fate simply brought it on faster. And we can look to the story of Oedipus for an easy example of this. Although it's easy to think of this outlook as a negative and depressing one, I think it was simply a coping mechanism. It was a way for the Greeks to accept life as it was in ancient times and to move forward the best way they knew how, putting one foot in front of the other. Now, I'm introducing this theme of Greek literature to address an important lesson that was meant to be learned by Homer's tragic tale of Troy. The Trojans were described as being honest and just men who lived in a fair and benevolent society, whether or not that was actually true. On the other hand, the Greek heroes were most often portrayed as cruel, greedy, and extremely vain. And yet, despite these differences, it was the Greeks who ended up winning the war in the end, and the Trojans lost everything. Now, this is again a common element in Greek literature, where it's simply the strongest that wins, which didn't always mean it was the good guys. Now cue the Romans. Even though they emulated Greek culture in almost all forms, they decided to draw their ancestry not from any of the famous Greek heroes in the Iliad, but from one of the Trojan heroes, Aeneas. And although Aeneas was only a minor background character in the royal family, this actually allowed the Romans to easily create a legend surrounding the character and then fantasize how he survived the final destruction of the city and escaped to later safety. Further, by drawing on one of the Trojan heroes, the Romans could lay greater claim to the idea that they were descended from a just and noble ancestry, and that they were the descendants of the legendary race of Trojans, and not the vain, egotistical Greeks that we see in the Iliad. Like the legend of Troy, it is apparent from our Roman authors that the story of Aeneas was a common oral legend before it was properly recorded by the author Virgil sometime around 19 BC, during the reign of the first emperor Augustus. And even though the details of Aeneas' legend are most likely not historical, meaning they quite likely never happened, they're still important for us to remember for a few reasons. The primary reason is that it's what the Romans believed. Now, we can definitely doubt the level to which the Romans actually believed many of these stories, and we even have some comments from Roman historians like Livy, who lived during the same time as Virgil, and he kind of cast some doubt on the believability of some of these legends. But even despite that, many Romans very likely did believe these legends, or they at least accepted them to the degree that they were satisfactory enough to explain their history and why their lives were the way that they were. Often, ancient people develop myths to explain things they don't understand, and it helped provide an explanation and understanding of why certain aspects of their lives were ordered the way that they were. The Romans probably wondered, why was their government structured the way it was? Why did they pray to the gods the way they did? And what determined which gods were responsible for which things? All of these questions and more were answered by legends and myths, and it helped ancient people conceptualize the world around them. Now, although I'm not an anthropologist, I think it's safe to say that the legend of Aeneas helped the Romans explain their ancient ancestry in a way that tied in with other familiar stories they knew, primarily the legend of Troy. Now, this gave them a larger sense of cohesion and togetherness with the various peoples in the Mediterranean, and it would have given them a sense of common pride to rally behind as well. Now, all of this is important to remember when thinking of other, later Roman legends as well. Most of Rome's early history, especially Rome's founding and the period under the monarchy, are almost entirely mythological. And despite that, these stories are still important for us to know and understand today, as they help us really understand the Romans. It allows us a way to peer into their minds. And before we are too quick to laugh and dismiss these legends as the fanciful stories of some ancient people, we can all probably think of similar stories from our own nation today. Thinking of America, my home country, I could readily point to the story of Paul Revere and his midnight ride. Now, much of this original story is actually quite exaggerated in the versions that we learned in school. But despite some of the inaccuracies of the details we may have learned in school, I think the importance of Paul Revere's story is more about the spirit of resistance and doing what was right during the American Revolution. Now, we could also point to other legendary characters in tales from America, like Rip Van Winkle, Johnny Appleseed, or even Davy Crockett. Now, why do we tell our children these stories, if not to impart some sort of moral lesson, or to try and capture the spirit of America, even if it's in a fanciful story? Although many of these stories may not have any literal truth to them, we still find ourselves growing up around them. And thinking of that, I'd like to think we could imagine Roman children sitting around a fire, listening to their relatives tell them the story of how a small band of Trojan refugees fled destruction and found safety in Italy. The times were hard, they were uncertain, but they managed to find a way. A Roman child leans in further to listen, not wanting to miss a beat, and he asks his uncle or grandmother to repeat that part of the story when Aeneas managed to visit the underworld and return in one piece. The relative humors them, pushing back bedtime a few more moments to retell that part of the story for the 10th time, before finally ushering them off to bed with a kiss. Now, with that picture in mind, the story of Rome ceases to be some distant thing studied by old men in dusty libraries, but a vibrant, breathing history, one that lives within each one of us. Thank you for listening. Feel free to check out our website at romeretold.com, where you can find out more about the podcast and find links to other platforms for listening. You can even support us through Patreon, where you can help support the time, money, and research that goes into providing this podcast. You can also find the link to our Discord server, where you can join our community, ask any questions, or offer suggestions for future podcast topics. Or you can just join in on any of our discussions about ancient Rome. Thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.